right, we have some people rolling in. Thank you for coming, everyone. While we're waiting, I am just going to launch a poll. So we have a little bit of an understanding of who's in the audience as we answer our questions. We'll know who we're talking to. All right. Good number of artists in the audience. Because we sold out, we are going to be also sharing this through Facebook, so others can also listen in. And just to give a clue in on how we're going to be using some of the tools today. So at the bottom bar, if you wiggle your mouse, you'll see a Q&A section come up. As we're going through the discussion today, just put your questions into that section, and we're going to have a healthy amount of time to get to those questions from the audience. The more specific, the better. So if we're, if you're worried about saying something that you think is really unique to your business, it could help someone else out there in the audience. So feel free to share. You can also use the chat function. If you want to introduce yourself to other people in the audience, just to let you know who's out there and see if there's connections that could be made between artists, makers, product-based makers. Please feel free to put that in the chat so we know who's here, know who we're talking to. We'll give it 5 more minutes to see if we have some more people trickling in. Seems so far that we have 8 people who have a small business here, 9 people who would like to have a small business. We have 25 who are an artist or artisan. Genevieve, you'll have a lot of good advice for them. Product-based makers, we have 8. Sharif will have some good advice. And contractor and freelancers, we have 8 of them here. And 2 people who have other. So if you want to clarify what other is, you might work with makers or be in the industry, you can pop that in the chat too. All right, I see some of our members. See Eric Zippy. Hi, everyone. All right. We're going to end the poll and we're going to get started. We'll share the results with everybody. So welcome everyone. My name is Anna. I am NextFab's sales manager and I'm going to be the host today. Today we're in our second part of our 5-part series in Making to Selling, which is about pricing and selling your work. If you're interested in the previous one, which is about enhancing your online presence and getting started, we are posting that to our website and on our social media channels. So you can stay tuned as you're trying to build out actually what online selling looks like as a maker. Today, really pleased to have Genevieve, and how do you pronounce your last name?
Itrubus.
Itrubus, thank you. From Center of emerging visual artists.
Center for Emerging Visual Artists.
Thank you. And she has extensive experience working with and being a visual artist yourself. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So hopefully she'll have some really good advice for us today. And we're also joined today with a member of NextFab #1, Sharif Pendleton, who is owner of Plaid, which is Philadelphia Laser and Industrial Design. Also has Philly Love Notes underneath that brand as well, which is another brand that people may be familiar with. So just to get started, Genevieve, do you want to give a little bit of the introduction to your background and what your expertise is in?
Sure. So I'm the Executive Artistic Director for CEVA, or the Center for Emerging Visual Artists. I am in my 19th year with them. So the answer to this question on how to price your work and the way artists approach selling their work is a little bit different now than when I started, but not too much. In addition to my work at CEVA, I am a visual artist. I'm a photographer. So I also have experience pricing my own work and kind of putting it out there. For those of you who don't know what CEVA does, we're an artist service organization. We provide fellowships, information, career counseling. We have residencies. We run Philadelphia Open Studio Tours in October and Art in the Open in the spring. Amongst other things, we work in the community. We have residencies in nursing homes. We work with artists who are teaching all over the community. So we also have a gallery in our space, and we also present work. So we often work with artists who are pricing their work both in our space and in other spaces.
Wonderful. And can someone be a member of CEVA?
Absolutely. So we have 1,000,001 ways to engage. We do have a membership program. One of our memberships, the entry membership, affords you discounts, for example, for NextFab and various other wonderful organizations in the city. We do have a local artist membership as well, which includes participation in Philadelphia Open Studio Tours and the ability to apply to various exhibitions in our space. We offer career counseling. I mean, you actually don't need to be a member to get some of that advice from us, but it is a community where I know in the era of COVID, we're having member meetups and everything online. When we have our gallery open, we would do that sort of thing in our space.
Thank you. And Sharif, would you like to go a little bit into your background? You've had a long career in products, making custom work, making your own work, so.
Yeah, so I'm Sharif Pendleton, the owner, founder of Philadelphia Laser and Industrial Design, aka Plaid. It is currently based at Cherry Street Pier. Plaid is about 2.5 years old, but I had a business before that called Masters of None that I started back in 2008, 2009. And actually my background is in fine arts. I went to UArts. I've got a degree in multimedia. I've done lots of things from photography to graphic design. I've just always had a love for product. And when NextFab appeared, it was sort of like one of those things that was really great for me because it meant that I could take those ideas and start to formulate them into products. So yeah, so from Masters of None to Philadelphia Laser and Industrial Design, there's been a lot of, I've made a ton of mistakes. I've had some really cool victories. And hopefully today I can share some of that with people and prevent folks from making the same pitfalls that I did. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. And where can people find your work?
So you can right now online at laserphilly.com. You can also follow me on the gram at laserphilly. I'm doing a ton of stuff in the background that you won't see right now because I'm doing a little bit of rebranding. We've got products that were when I start. So right now at Cherry Street Pier, what Plaid is, there's 3 parts of the business. Actually, I forgot this part. So there's 3 parts. One part is gift shop. Part 2 is custom work, and Part 3, as Anna mentioned, is Philly Love Notes, which I took over towards the end of last year. So that's essentially what comprises Plaid. When I started, it was meant to be really a physical location that people could come to and buy things, because it was the first time that I had a physical space. Up until then, everything had been for sale online or through other shops in the tri-state area and across the country. And of course, obviously now that no one really can go into any shops, what I've had to do is sort of pivot a little bit, like everybody else, and just concentrate a little bit more to online. And in doing so, I decided, you know what, we also need a little bit of a refresh. So all that's happening simultaneously. So if you find yourself bored with Netflix or things like that, check in on laserphilly.com every now and then to see some changes and new products that'll be hitting the website.
Awesome, thank you. So just to get started right into our discussion, just to recap for everyone who's here, we are going to have 30 minutes of Q&A with me and the panelists exclusively, and then we're going to get to your questions for 30 minutes at the end. So as we're talking, if you're thinking of questions, please pop them in the Q&A button that you'll see at the bottom bar on your screen, and we will get to them when the time comes. Thank you. So get to kicking off this topic. Starting with pricing, which is a really complex thing to start approaching, we have the very general question of how do you start to even identify what pricing model is best for you? I know both of you are sort of working in two different worlds. Genevieve, you're in the fine arts, which is really sometimes hard to compare between two people. And Sharif, you're working with sometimes making multiples of things in a cost-effective manner. So Genevieve, do you want to get started just kicking off with that question?
Sure. And, I think with pricing, there are other approaches. I mean, I will give you my opinion on the best way. There are a couple of things that I think are absolutely non-negotiable. But, everybody approaches it in different ways. My advice when an artist comes in and is wondering how to price their work, and this advice comes from having had experts come into SIVA over the years and kind of say the same thing. We used to run a direct dialogue lecture series, and every year we would do how to price your work, and it would be the sold out talk. And what it really boiled down to is don't fluctuate your prices and don't devalue your work. So when I'm asking people to say, okay, where do you want to start? What do you have to make from this piece? When does it not even become worth your while? Whether that's material cost, whether that's time. For different artists, it's different things, but take that amount and at the very least double it. Because if you're successful, if you're able to go to a space that's going to sell it or to a gallery, they'll take 50%. There's some places that don't take 50%, and you can view that as getting a little bit more back. That's great. You may be selling from your studio, and that's wonderful. Then you get 100%. It's much better to fix the cost at a certain amount. And then if you want to offer someone a discount, that's fine. If someone comes to your studio and says, what's the price on this? You can say, if I were selling through a gallery, it would be, let's say, $200. But because you're coming directly to my studio, I'm happy to take 25% off. That's a much more effective way than changing your price around based on where it's selling or who's going to buy it. So that's really the first step, is figure out what that amount that you need to make is and double it. And often that price can sometimes be, I know, for example, when I was pricing my photography, once I printed and framed and did everything, my out-of-pocket costs were about $900, let's say, off the bat. So off the bat, it has to be $1,800. And then you start to add on top of that. And that's really when you get into what does the market bear? What does that price look like in relation to people who are kind of at the same space that you are in their career? What does that price look like compared to what else is in the gallery? I think it's hard when you're pricing to either have it too high or too low. but that middle ground then becomes personal. And I'm sure we'll dig a little deeper in our conversation, but that's kind of my baseline for artists, is just make sure what you need to get and double it as your starting point.
That's good advice. Sharif, do you want me to restate the question?
Yeah, please.
So starting off, like, how do you identify what pricing model works for you?
So it's funny because I was listening to Genevieve, and it's so much of the same thing. Like, it seems like it's different worlds, but I think what you have to keep in mind as an artist, designer, maker, however you identify, is that if you put yourself in a position to make a living off of what you're doing, you have to make money off of it, right? And I think a lot of times, for a lot of people, that might feel weird or gross, or it feels scary. But the bottom line is that's the business you're in. Whatever it is, you have to be able to make money off of it. So I would say, like, just don't be afraid of the number. Don't be afraid of numbers in general. I think what Genevieve said is totally true for product as well. What is your cost? And, like, how do you cover it and then make money on top of that? And I think there's a few different ways. There's different methods. Generally, there's like 3 different methods that sort of, when it comes to product, that people kind of refer to. And I think actually the sweet spot is a combination kind of all 3. So there's sort of the cost plus model, which is your costs plus labor plus overhead. What is that total? And then, like, what is your markup, right? So, like, typically it's like a 50% markup. So you multiply that times 1.5, you get that number, and that sort of starts to get at, like, how much money do you actually get to keep that goes into your other account. There's sort of the dynamic variable model, which I don't know. To me, this one is always sort of like, think like Uber, right? Like, those prices change depending on the weather, depending on how many cars are on the road. So, and obviously, all of this really depends. Like, this is just an interesting topic for me because everybody needs to know this, but before you can really know this, you really have to know your business, because all of this really depends on what you're making, how you're making it. And having said that, the last sort of one, because I named 2, the last one is value-based. So essentially, it's like, what do you think people are willing to pay? And that usually requires research, right? Asking people. And I would say that, like, not like asking your mom, who might be like, oh, honey, it's great. Everything you ate is so great. Like, ask her. That's good. Like, get her opinion. It matters, but only to a certain extent, because your mother might not be your customer. You know what I mean? So, like, if you're going to start with people who you know, like, ask people who you trust, who are going to give you their true opinions, without the flavor of knowing you. And then if that kind of thought is scary, like, start with your inner circle and then, like, expand, start to ask strangers what they might pay for something.
So you both mentioned a specific topic here, which is about research. Where would you suggest going? Sharif, you sort of touched on it, like, don't be afraid to ask strangers, but where would you recommend people going for proper research? Is it going to, say, the gallery? Is it talking to other artists who are in a similar space? Genevieve, what would you suggest?
I mean, I think anytime you want to be in the art world, I think going out and being part of it, going to receptions, looking at artwork, visiting galleries, getting to know other artists, sitting in crit groups, all of those things are going to help you as an artist and help your career. If you're not connected in, or you're not quite sure where to go, you can always go to a place like Siva, and we'll sit down for half an hour, 45 minutes, and give you some suggestions about where to be. But each market is different. There are markets that I don't know, so I often will have artists who have been successful here who are, popping up to New York, let's say, and their gallery off the bat wants to double their price. So here I am saying to everyone, don't change your prices, don't do this. And then they have an opportunity and their prices are going to change. I think There's a fluidity when you talk about pricing your work. There's a fluidity, even if you did all the research. Now, it might be a little bit different in product, and especially product that you're selling online, because my guess is those markets, and in the fine art world now too, those markets are coming a lot closer. 5 or 6 years ago, what was happening in one city was not happening in the other. Now, you know, it's a whole new world. But really trying to figure out where you're trying to be as a first step. Are you trying to show in Philly? Are you exhibiting your pieces there? Then connect to the world, look online, see who's working in the same way that you do, and find out that way. Because again, with the pricing, like, there's no magic formula. So it's not to say I'm a photographer 3 years out of school who works, you know, in this way, this is what it should be. I think seeing what's out there and figuring out where you fit is the best way to do it.
Yeah. And I think that, yeah, it's about connecting. Research really is about connecting with like-minded people, or people who work in a very similar medium or method. You have to know what's out there so that you can, it's not about like sort of emotionally comparing yourself to it, right? Because you do want to take the emotion out, especially when it comes to pricing. Like, it will not serve you in most cases. I think there's some instances where I can sort of imagine it being, you know, it working, but it's about saying, like, having an honest look at what it is you're making, how you're making it, and then seeing, like, oh, how is that person doing the exact same thing for half of what it seems like I can sell it for? Like, and being really honest with yourself. Because sometimes in that scenario, what that might come down to is, if that person's been doing it for 20 years and you've been doing it for 5, they just have, like, their method. Maybe they're just faster at it, in which case the pricing of your work needs to be adjusted in some way to reflect your experience doing it. But, you know, and further in terms of research, I mean, online is a really great resource. I will say it can be overwhelming, and I would caution, like, I think Etsy does really good things for design community in a way, but it also does some detrimental things. I mean, it is just flooded with all sorts of things that, you know, people are selling at whatever price. It doesn't necessarily mean it's profitable for them, right? So when it comes to research, you sort of like do enough of it. But again, this goes back to knowing who you are, what your work is, and figuring out what your value is there, because you may not be able to match what you're seeing out there. And it's not about matching it. It's about understanding how how your thing is differentiated from that, so that you can offer like a value proposition to people. The other thing I would say is that, if, for me, and it depends on where you're selling. So when I started selling through shops, I went and talked to the shop owners. I got like a lot of rejections early on. I was like, hey, will you sell my stuff? And they're like, no. Like, okay, but that's okay. Like, you know, over years or months or whatever, I could show up with more stuff and be like, hey, this is the kind of thing I'm making. This is unique. And essentially, you know, this is sort of boiling it down, but essentially it comes down to that conversation. Will you sell it? The other thing is, like, I know that things are really, really different right now. We might not be able to do this right now, but in general, like, if you're an artist and making something handmade, like, go to craft shows. Go to events where you want your stuff to be sold. See what is there. See how that stuff is doing. If you can get to know a shop owner, to ask them, like, hey, who generally comes in here to buy this stuff? How is it moving? Do that. Oh, did I lose you all?
Nope.
You're still there.
Oh, okay. There you go.
Yes.
So I mean, get to know people. The other thing about that is there's a multiplying effect to getting to know who's out there, right? Like, you will find allies, you will find people who will happily, something that you thought was a guarded secret will happily be like, oh no, I just do this. I just buy from this guy. It's so much better for you. So, like, there is a multiplying effect. And then, you know, hopefully the idea is you also pay it forward, and that it becomes an exchange of things. So everybody sort of moves forward.
So one of the things I hear you saying, Sharif, is sort of knowing your expertise and your value. I think in that cost structure, there is the in that first model you mentioned, which talks about knowing, like, how many hours you put into something and what your labor cost is. I think that one is a really hard one for people to be honest with. What kind of advice would you give people when even trying to determine how much they really should be paying themselves when making work.
So for me, it's about, and I know this from like I mentioned earlier, like I've made tons of mistakes, right? So, and I know I have a feeling to reference, and I know that in the first version of this business, early products, I love the product. I love the product. People liked the product, they bought the product, but at the end of the day, be like, oh, this is so great, I love it, but it makes me, I don't love the feeling I have of not actually taking home, like the dollar amount that I'm getting does not match the feeling that I have for making the thing or representing the thing. Like there has to be some parity there. And that's where, again, like taking some of the emotion out is really, really good. And the other thing is like, so I always tell people like math is not my first language. I am not naturally a numbers person. I'm just not, but you have to do it. And first, like, just accept that you have to do it. There is no way around it. It just isn't. So once you get past that, think in terms of categorizations, right? And this is, so think about labor costs. And when it comes to labor costs about paying yourself, I think if you're someone who does not have any employees, right? Think about how much would you pay someone to do the job that you're doing? And like, along with that comes, what would you expect their level of craft to be, right? Like, is this work that could be done by someone who is right out of college? Is it work that can be done by a very skilled tradesman? Like, you have to be realistic with how much that stuff, like how much that labor would cost you. And then like, I think sort of work backward and say, okay, that's what I'm willing to pay myself, or that plus X number of dollars because I'm the owner. The other part about that is, it is being very real with your overhead costs. So if you rent a studio, if you have to pay electricity on that studio, like you have to account for all of those things on top of your material costs. So there are three sort of categories there. So, and because I'm not naturally math inclined, like categorization is actually really good for me, because that is something that you can put on a chart, put in a sheet that you can just do, and then it's done. It's like, okay, materials cost X, labor cost X, overhead cost X, and then you come up with formulas. You total all those things up and decide how much do you need to make in order to cover all that and walk away with money in your pocket.
Yeah, I will say Excel and spreadsheets are really helpful with math.
Yeah.
Genevieve, you were about to say something.
Yeah, so, and I think too, because how does that translate into the fine art world where things can be so different? Very early on in my time with Siva, I worked with an artist, and her paintings were so detailed that they would take her about 6 months each. So she would create 2 very beautiful pieces a year. And so her price point is going to be different, right? Speaking to what Sharif was saying in terms of how fast. So I think looking at your own practice and really, and also understanding about how you're trying to support yourself through your art, because if you're making 2 paintings a year and you have to sell the work to support yourself, you might need a handful of years at the beginning of your career because you probably won't be able to sell at that price point. So what are some other things? Artists have gotten very creative. Technology has allowed people to become more creative. Sometimes artists will do a limited edition print set based on their paintings. There was one artist that I was always mesmerized by his cost structure. He would have his fine art, that was priced maybe $8,000. That was one of a kind. And then his editions would go down from that till the very end, where he would have open sourced editions. So he would have, you could buy the exclusive piece for $8,000. You could buy the limited edition 1 of 5 for, let's say, $2,000, and then it just went down to the open edition that was $50 a print. So I think that for fine artists, I think also understanding what art sales, what place they take up in your career. If you're also teaching, there's a lot of things that that artists do to support themselves. So really kind of figuring out how much of my income does need to come from sales in the immediate.
Before we go to the Q&A from the audience, I have one last question, which is about professionalism. Genevieve, you talked a little bit about keeping your prices the same across galleries, online. So how do you stay professional, and then how do you know when you have to actually change the price, and how do you do that?
Well, and I think you can change the price of pieces. So like I said, I mean, certainly if you go into a commitment with a gallery, they may set those prices for you. Generally, a gallery won't lower them. I mean, that likely wouldn't happen. And the argument for that could be that the value of you as an artist perhaps has gone up and the price of the pieces have gone up. What you really don't want to do, it's okay to change your prices as long as they stay stable once you change them. What you don't want to do is have different prices out in the marketplace, especially for the same piece. I mean, you can, I was watching your talk last week, and I think Rachel touched on this, where you can absolutely create a different piece and talk about how it's made in a different way, or, you know, and price that differently. Your work doesn't need to be every piece you create is the same amount. But you don't want a collector who has purchased, you know, maybe a photograph that was an edition of 1 out of 5 to find it for, you know, $1,000 less somewhere else. More you can usually deal with, but you just don't want someone, you don't want to devalue the work that you've already sold or devalue your own work.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing is true for product in store. So again, it depends on how you plan on selling your work. If you're the only person who's ever going to sell that work, you get to price it a little bit differently because your take home is different. But if you are working on consignment or wholesale, right, like you generally take that price, you know, whatever it cost you. So if, you know, you make something and your out-of-pocket cost to make it is $3, you essentially would sell it to wholesale for $6, right? So that way you cover your $3 cost, you make $3 back, and then the shop sells it for $12. Then because they cover their $6 and they make $6 back, like that's generally how that works. And in that case, if you are selling through a shop on wholesale or consignment or anything like that, but you were also selling direct to public, it's a bad look to have your direct sales to public be lower than what the other shop is selling it for, because you're essentially competing with them, and that's not what you want to do. And on top of just that, I mean, like professionalism is the right word there, because on top of sort of confusing the customer, it does not do great things for you in the community that you inhabit with that shop or other artists. So you just, like, consistency is the name of the game there.
Yeah, I often hear artists say, well, you know, because so at SIVA in our gallery, we take 25%. And often artists not, you know, they may be in a show and have one piece with us and they'll say, oh, well, because you're taking 25%, add this. Going back to kind of the first statement that I made, if you always have a price that whether it's, you know, wholesale or in the gallery that is 50% is taken out, then you'll never have to add. But it is a bad look to have something, you know, fluctuate like that.
Well, on that note, we're going to switch to the Q&A from the audience. We're going to start with one pre-submitted question from Lori, which is mostly directed towards you, Genevieve. How do you approach pricing fine art sculpture as opposed to two-dimensional fine art? Is there a formula you recommend based on the sculpture's volume?
Not specifically. When I'm working with sculptors or when we have work in our gallery, generally it's a similar principle. An artist who's working in bronze, the piece is going to be way more expensive than perhaps another material that wouldn't have anything to do with the size or, so for me, I think again, it's that formula of the cost, what are you putting into it, time, you know, all of that goes in. And, you know, what similar work goes for. It's the same, you know, research. I personally don't tell artists to approach sculpture differently. There may be others who feel differently, but I don't.
Good advice. We'll go to a question from Cody. how do you determine your overhead, and how would you adjust that over time?
Is that for me, or?
Yeah, I think you can kick it off, Sharif.
So overhead is, for me, is anything that goes into support of making the product, right? Again, it's studio time, store space, it's electricity, it's all of those things. And if you're, I mean, you adjust it over time, honestly. Like if your rent goes up, you keep that on the line and you account for what that costs. Hopefully what's happening there is those costs are being dispersed over multiple numbers of products, objects, artwork. So it's not that every single piece has to give you the equivalent back towards your overhead, but you need to know what that is overall and, you know, set a goal for how to reclaim that or how to put money towards that.
You cut out a little bit towards the end there, Sharif. Could you just repeat that last sentence?
Does that make sense? Yeah, I just said that it's not that every single thing you sell has to give you the equivalent value towards accounting for that overhead, but it's that you kind of need to know what that number is overall for your business so that you know percentage-wise overall how much of your final accounting of revenue goes towards covering that overhead.
And Genevieve, would you recommend a similar approach like in art as well?
I think, yes, in terms of determining that 50%, again, it's a little different depending on where you are in your career, depending on what type of work you make, if you're working in editions versus working on a individual piece. But I think that anything that goes into your cost is taken into account. Sometimes as an artist myself, there have been situations where once I double that, it becomes quite high, and I've personally decided to take it down a little bit, but that's up to each artist. I believe that a lot of work will sell. It just depends on when, you know, so if you price your work at a certain amount, you may not sell this year or next that work, but as your career develops and as you go, you know, if you've created a 15-foot painting, that may not sell the year that it's created, but you know, 2 or 3 years down the road it may. So making sure that when that painting leaves your studio, you still feel good about it, and you feel like you haven't undercut yourself and your cost, I think is sometimes more important than immediately selling the piece.
Right. You have the next question. How should my pricing reflect multiple brands I may have? As an artist, I show and sell to X audience. As a designer, maker, fabricator, I sell to Y. Is there an ability to foster an overlapping audience, or should I keep the different brands separate?
That's a doozy.
Sure. I see Sharif thinking. I think so. Should you keep those brands separate from the maker and the artist audience?
I think that I think there's probably, it depends on what it is, because I think there's value in it. Sort of like when Genevieve was speaking earlier about the artist who had the work that could sell for $8,000 and then had, you know, a different tier. I think that could also work for artist designer. It really depends on what it is, and you kind of need to know your audience. For me, yeah, and I don't know what the brands are. It sort of depends on what the brands are. Like if they're like sort of diametrically opposed, you want to keep them opposite. If they're really close but just a few degrees off, personally, I would rather on the back end, just for less gray hair, I would rather sort of combine them and figure out how to talk to both those audiences at the same time, because I think there, you know, potentially if people are buying from you in 2 different brands, there could be an opportunity to cross-sell and crossover. So personally, I would tend towards combination.
And I would say in my limited collection of work, I've often, because I don't have the resources to get, if I, you know, the pieces that I would love to buy, I don't often have those resources, but an artist who's working in that way, I will often buy something that they're creating, that maybe is, a lesser, something that's not the huge, beautiful painting I want, because I have a piece of that artist. So I think you could also do yourself a disservice by keeping your audiences completely separate. Again, as Sharif said, though, if the two works aren't relatable at all, then I think then it becomes a little bit of a moot point.
Yeah, I'll also say, like, from a sales perspective, I know I'm not selling art, but often people are admiring the thing that they want in the future. Like I see as me, who's who's not going to spend a couple thousand on a painting, but I hope someday I will be able to. So I definitely want to support the artists in the way I can now. So I think that could definitely be beneficial.
And that happens often. I mean, that's where the lines come in, where major designers will create a product for a completely different audience, and that generally sells, because of the designer's name. I think it also has to do with where you are in your career. I mean, certainly if the person who's asking the question is established and or has their own audience, then my guess is that people would be really interested in buying work that might not be as high of a price point.
Okay, we have the next question from Kristen. I was going to ask about Etsy and whether it's worthwhile to try and utilize it, or whether it makes more sense to try to market yourself on your own site.
I think as many potential avenues of income as you can maximize, I say go for it. Again, you just have to be aware of what that's going to do. Like, be aware, like, if you're on Etsy, then you must know that there's a ton of stuff out there. Etsy, what I will say is that they've got a lot of how-tos, and the understanding is if you really follow them and really take their suggestions, you're able to sort of make some headway where you get recognized and noticed there. So for me, it's not a question of either or, but it's both, and that comes down to, can you manage it, right? So right off the bat, if you can only do one, you kind of have to decide where you can put your time. Etsy comes with a lot of built-in tools. You just upload things, name things, and you're done. If you've got more time to develop a website, okay, great. But you also then have to think about search engine optimization, et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately, I would say, personally, it's both.
Okay. Move on to the next question. Any suggestions on programs or systems for pricing individual pieces instead of using just Excel or spreadsheets?
I'm sure they're out there, but I don't know them. I know that they're out there. I don't know what they are. I think the thing is, like, Excel might not be fun, but it's if you don't have Microsoft Excel, then you can get Google Sheets. It doesn't really cost you anything. And I think, so I'm going to borrow a line from sort of Genevieve. It really depends on like where you are in your career. Like, especially if you're just beginning, I would say, this might not be the popular opinion, it's really important to get close to those numbers. Do it the hard way. Like, know your numbers so that when you find that software, you can just plug it in a lot easier, because there will be variables that you have to account for in the future. And it's better to get a really good picture of your business the hard way before you go and sort of leap towards the thing that's going to help you, sort of cheat a little bit.
All right, we have a good practical question. Do you consider taxes income/sales when pricing?
That is not one of the numbers that's sort of in my line sheet. That comes later. That sort of becomes a difference between when you go from understanding what your gross is to what your net is. And then to me, the way that I do mine is it's actually sort of like a whole different ballpark, because that gets into sort of profit margins, end of year kind of stuff. So I don't, when I'm pricing things out, like there isn't a line where taxes are accounted for there, but obviously I pay my taxes.
Great. And Genevieve, do you have advice on this?
Well, when we're exhibiting in the gallery, obviously we're exhibiting without taxes. I approach that question a little bit more from the buyer's perspective. Would you price it based on what, specifically the sales tax question, on how much tax would be added? I think when you're in the fine art world, if you're buying a $10,000 piece, then, spending the tax money probably isn't in consideration. So I think with sales tax, it increases by the cost of the piece. Most artists that we work with don't even pay attention to what the buyer is going to be paying in sales tax.
Great, good to know. I see a question came through in the chat from Maria. Genevieve, could you go over pricing when doing an original and copies when the work is photography?
Yeah, I think it depends. I think it depends on the edition. I think, sometimes photographers will make an incredibly small edition. I think over the years, what I've noticed, photographers' editions are much smaller than they used to be. I think with photography, there are more rules. And I think, again, I'd have to know, does someone want to make 1 of 5? Some people make 1 of 5 and the last of the edition is, X percentage more than the first. There are a lot of different ways to do that.
Thank you. All right, we have one more question that came through, and we still have some time for more. So if people who are watching are thinking about a question, now's the time. Okay, I've been at this for a while and only now realizing I need to focus more on bookkeeping and accounting. I am not a numbers person either. Are there local resources for small craft-based businesses to help them with numbers? And when do you get to the point where you say, I want to hire a bookkeeper?
So for me, I got to that point when it was like, oh, this is a real business that I intend to keep going and want to and have to pay taxes on and have to account for this actual money. Like, it's not a hobby, it's an actual business. That to me is when I went, okay, I need an accountant, right? Like, I need someone else who I can bounce ideas off of. And it's not that my accountant, like, she doesn't do, there's everyday sort of paperwork and numbers that I have to do that I pass off to her. So like, you still have to stay close to the numbers, but first and foremost, if it's your business and not a hobby, then I think you're at that point. Because what that hopefully will allow you to do is it takes so much of the burden off of you. Like, you don't have to think about it constantly. If you know that there is a resource that you have that you can go to, or you're just doing your monthly numbers that you pass off to someone else, like, it really does just feel like a weight off of you. In terms of local resources, again, in some ways I feel bad because I don't know, because I'm sort of like a dinosaur in a way. Like, some of these I've, like, I learned the hard way and just sort of found my accountant, it never turned back. I know that, we've got resources in the city like the PVLA, Philadelphia Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts. I don't know how far that goes in terms of financial advice or if it's just strictly sort of legal things, but I'd seek it out. But I think that it's either way, it is worth it if you find yourself going, if you're in an enviable position to be like, I have so many orders or so many things and this money is moving in and out, like, get yourself a numbers person so that you can actually have perspective on, but you're exchanging money, but are you making money?
Oh, I was just going to say, often we have artists will come to us and say whether they've been working with an accountant or a bookkeeper. That's fantastic, and we keep that in our files. So then when somebody calls us and says, we're really looking for someone, we can pass on that match. Because often if you're working, whether it's a bookkeeper or an accountant, they really have to understand art. They need to understand, it's usually a different situation. So if anybody's looking for that sort of thing, they can outreach to SIVA and we can look back through our notes.
That's great. Do they contact you through the website?
Well, it used to be that they would give me a call and it would ring at my desk, but I would say the best way is just to contact through email, which can be found on the website, or I guess I could also put in the comments.
Okay, and we'll share it in the follow-up email to everyone who attended today.
Great.
All right, we have another question from Cody. What are your thoughts on added cost to customers like shipping? A lot of companies out there are offering free shipping. Keeping price consistency and competition in mind, how should a small business navigate this topic?
Oof, that's a tough one. So you will find that a lot of people, there's a lot of advice out there to offer free shipping because it helps people push the button sooner, like put it in your cart sooner and get free shipping. I think that you have to determine if that's right for your business. There is a really good reason to offer free shipping because it does remove a barrier. So in any kind of business, the more barriers you can move from like a maybe to a yes, you want to do that. If shipping is one of those barriers that you can afford to do, then offer it. If you do your numbers and it doesn't look like you can afford to do it, then don't do it. I think that it is an added cost that you have to account for. I would think that counts in the overhead section. So I mentioned earlier those three parts. It's materials, labor, and overhead. Shipping, including the cost of your labels or stamps or envelopes. All that stuff needs to be accounted for. The good news about doing something like that is if you are making many different products or you're making just multiples of the same thing, if you can buy those shipping materials in bulk, by the time you do the numbers, what you're actually paying for it is really hopefully nominal. And so if you can offer free shipping, if it feels like you're losing like 27 cents, it's like, well, can you sacrifice that 27 cents for the greater sale? Yes. Or can you do something where, hey, one item is not free shipping, but you cross sell for something else and then offer free shipping. So you sort of cover the cost of what it may have cost you to ship out that one or two things. So I think there are sort of ways in which you can work with those numbers to get them to work in your favor.
I think I don't think the question was directed to me, but I think for fine art, it's very tricky. And the concept of art handling and how to ship, and if something's very shippable, for sure. When we sell out of the gallery, we do not include shipping. We are now that we're working a little bit more remotely, we're investigating how we're going to handle that if we do put work online. But the cost to properly art handle certain fine art or a lot of fine art are much higher and can't be predicted probably in the same way. Smaller items.
All right, we have another question. Do you have advice on starting to build an art/design business alongside an unrelated full-time job? And I think that there's an example of the pace of growing your business and how to know when is the right time to try and make this side business your full-time job.
I'm actually, so I have a full-time job, and most people just think I'm crazy for having both. But I will say that I am in a very fortunate position that before all of this, I was always able to work remotely. I just sort of have been able to do that. I will tell you that it is a genius idea in theory to have to, like, if you can work it, but in practice, it's really, really hard. And so you have to really like what you do. You have to really do it with intention. And you need to set really clear, good boundaries. Like, when do you stop working? When do you start working? Like, do you work on the weekends? Like, what are the very clear boundaries? So like, if you're thinking about starting it, like, put those boundaries in place. Think about how fast you want to grow, how far you intend to take the business. And is it something that you once started will want to keep going? Or is this sort of like, oh, I had this idea and I just wanted to do 10 of them? Like if it's really a business, right? Like then that's different. But I would say like you have to set really clear boundaries for yourself. And in terms of when to make that switch over, somebody much smarter than me can probably tell you that, because I don't know. Again, I'm in a fortunate position to love both things. And for me, what that has meant is hiring people. Like I have to bring people in to do the things that I would want to do, but as the business owner, it makes no sense for me to be doing myself while I have other things to do. So, yeah, I think the word that comes to mind for me first though is boundaries. Like just really determine how far you're willing to go with things and where you can take it.
And I think, each person's tipping point as to when they leave their full-time work to pursue their dreams is going to be different. It's based on what type of expenses you have, what obligations you have that are outside of the business. One thing, with the fine arts, often when I'm, we have a lot of artists who say, I really want to make my living full-time, making work. And sometimes when you do that, that may mean that you need to then continue to make the work that people are interested in buying, and you may not be able to experiment as much. So I think really sitting down and saying, what do I Sharif, what you were saying, what do I love about this? How much do I want to pursue this? And if the answers come out that you really love it and that you want to make the work that's selling, and that's great. But sometimes having an extra source of income can also free up your studio practice. It can be constraining time-wise. You may not have time to get into your studio, and that's devastating for artists. But sometimes not having to worry about money also, it can go both ways.
I think there's definitely, it's that sort of age-old trade-off of time versus money. Like when you have one as an artist, you don't typically have the other. So, yeah.
And sometimes it can be different at different stages. You can do something for one period of time and then do something out for another. There's no problem with that.
So I want to be respectful of both of your time. We're nearing 2 o'clock. So I just wanted to end with a question. If you were to pick, your first 3 steps when starting to price your work and looking at pricing your work, what advice would you give to artists and to makers?
First 3 steps, I'm sorry, of what?
To start to approach pricing your work.
Oh.
I mean, I think I can jump in with what I said for the first part, was just make sure you know what your costs are, that whatever will be doubled, and then do your research, be part of the community, talk to other artists, really understand where the impact of your numbers hit the larger market.
Yeah, I would say like number 1, I think is, oh man, this is like I'm taking the SATs, because it's like number 1, but then there are sections A through C. So like number 1 is like know yourself, right? Which includes like what is your tolerance for risk, for loss, things like that. Number 2, know your audience. You have to know what people are going to be willing to pay. And I would count audience in this case, I'm going to be really generous and say audience is also sort of people who are making similar things. Let's just, for the sake of this argument, make it that too. And number 3 is like, don't be afraid of the numbers and start crunching them sooner rather than later. You do not, because we talked a lot about this earlier, like about fluctuations and how that does not do well for you. You do not want to find yourself in the position where you have put something out there and realize, wait, this is actually costing me money. I am paying people to take this off my hands, and then have to go and correct that. So if you're starting off, do that early.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both for joining us today. I hope you and the audience found this valuable. I got a few questions that, yes, we are going to be sharing the recording. You'll get a follow-up email with links to both of them and their organizations, so Center for Emerging Visual Artists and also Plaid. So if you have questions or you think either of Sharif or Genevieve's resources would be useful for you, please feel free to reach out. I said that this is second part of a 5-part series, just letting everyone know that we are skipping a week next week due to a scheduling conflict. And we're going to have a double whammy the following week, which is setting up your e-commerce platform directly through Instagram, which is going to be really neat. And then followed up, so that's going to be on Tuesday. Thursday, we're having online marketing and social media. So adding fuel to the fire as we're setting up your online presence. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Bye.